I didn't realize that.
Happy Friday, everyone. We got Friday stuff to do today, so just want to get started on that. Real quick note, we're going to do Excel first. I think the Excel stuff should be pretty easy. Please make sure you download that. I've also uploaded a new AI activity. It's in the week 4 content folder. It's AI activity 2 slides. There's also a document below that you'll want to download. We will be doing like our activity right off the bat. And the activity will be related to that document. So you want to make sure you have that downloaded. But let's do the fun stuff. Let's talk about Excel. Excel is kind of cool in the fact that it can do data parsing very well, but it doesn't necessarily follow an intuitive pattern. And I believe a lot of that has to do with the Visual Basic framework. Because one thing that you don't see when you work in Excel is that it does operate on computerized code. And anything that you do in Excel will actually be translated into that code. So certain things that are very easy for the code to recognize, it doesn't really matter how you form it or how you conduct that how you conduct that particular activity. The code will actually be able to recognize that. Certain other ones, specifically when using formulas, have to be formatted in a very specific way. Now, fortunately, newer versions of Excel have picked up on being able to do shortcuts, which is nice. But one thing we're going to see is that because of older restrictions is that the sequence of operations don't necessarily follow an intuitive pattern for certain Excel formulas. So we're going to operate with some of my favorite formulas. I use if functions all the time. And if you're any kind of reasonable Excel user, you probably do use if functions too. If is kind of the generalized parsing function. It's not the only one, but it's the primary parsing function I would say that's used in Excel. So generally, I had a pretty straightforward pattern for this, and I'm going to make them up as I go along. But let's just go ahead. Let's write a very basic if function. Let's just go ahead and right below where it says if, we're going to use on this information up here and write out some basic criteria that we'll be looking for. So for this one, we're going to say if, and if is basically going to start out, or I guess I probably should say equals if. Remember, you have to start out every formula with the equal sign. My bad. Equals if. And then we're going to say logical test. And we're just going to set up a very basic logical test. We're going to say cell B2 equals, and then quotation marks AIS. So we're saying the discipline next to Michael Barnes has to equal AIS, which makes sense because that's who the AIS instructor is. And then we're going to set a criteria. We're going to do something goofy. We'll say yay, okay. And then if not, we'll say boo. Now I'm assuming everybody in the room knows what this is basically setting up. It's saying that if that says AIS next to it, it's going to return the result yay. If not, it's going to return the result boo. And of course, it does have AIS there, so yay. If I change this over, if I say we're going to make Dr. Barnes a tax instructor, obviously that's going to be a boo right there. Okay, it's going to be a boo because at least I don't know that I would say the boo, but I think all of the people who had to take my class taught in tax would have to say boo because it would be a misery. I'd be like saying, so do you guys think this is right? This looks good to me. Yeah. My knowledge of tax is very minimal, very remedial. I was dangerous enough to pass the CPA exam. That's about it. All right. So let's go ahead and move on to another parsing function. We're going to do the AND function. Now, again, parsing does not follow grammatical distinction. Keep in mind when we use the AND as a conjunction in the English language, we usually say some condition, then we follow it with another condition, but those are separated by AND. In Excel, when you use AND as a parsing condition, you have to say it first, and then you have to set the criteria afterwards. So right here below AND, we're going to say equals, and let's just go ahead and set up our managerial condition. So we're going to say equals and we're doing 2 logical criteria. We're going to say B4 equals managerial. And then we're going to say B5 equals financial, because we need to really clearly define who's teaching managerial and who's teaching financial. So B4 equals managerial equals financial, and those are both true. So it's going to give us that result back as true. Okay, that's just the condition. Sure. Yeah. So we have to start out with and, which is really, really awkward. That doesn't necessarily follow intuitive patterns, but it's important to know that this is something we have to set up that way properly in order for the parsing function to work. All right. Now, keep in mind that and is looking for both conditions to be correct. if I change any one of the conditions, so let's say I change Dr. Otero to auditing, she'd hate that. Then it's going to send that condition to false. So both conditions have to be met. Conversely, let's go ahead and set up an or condition. So we're going to say, we're going to stick with Dr. Otero on this. We're going to send an or condition. Now, this could actually follow multiple parameters of the same parameter multiple times. So we're just going to do the same parameter multiple times. Let's go ahead and set an or condition. We're going to say B4 has to equal managerial. We're also going to say B4 equals cost. So looking for one of those conditions to be met. And if that's the case, it is managerial currently. So it says true. If I change it to cost, it will also be true. So you will notice up here, just changed to false when I did that. So it's just looking for one of those conditions to be met. And just for context, this can work across multiple criteria as well. If I wanted to set an or criteria across multiple cells, so I'm going to say equals or. I'm going to say B4 equals, we'll just say cost just for posterity. And then I want to say or B5 equals financial. Going to return the result true because one of those conditions is at least met. Doesn't really matter that this doesn't say cost, and this one does say financial. Now, if I change this to financial, what would be a class Dr. Asen would hate to teach? I want to say auditing, but I think you'd just be kind of like, okay, that's fine. What is the let's do calisthenics. Calisthenics. All right, yeah, that would be a good one. I don't know. He'd probably be cool with that too. Dr. Eisen is very easy to please. Okay. All right. So these are very clear operators, and if you know how they work, they're pretty easy to use. And I think that they have a lot of power associated with them, but they become exponentially more powerful when you use them together. So I'm a big fan of paired functions and nested functions, as we're going to see here shortly. Idea being is that we have two formulas that we can use together, and if we use them together, they can comprise more than their whole. So if actually only sets up conditions. But and or, while they actually look at multiple conditions, they are limited in their response. What if I create an if function that also uses an and function along with it? I can not only look at multiple functions, but or multiple criteria, but I can also dictate or tailor my response. So let's say we're going to use an if function, and then we're going to follow that immediately with an and function. So the and function is going to be our logical step. So we'll just set two criteria. We're going to say B2 equals AIS and B3 equals tax. Believe it or not, there was a time when Dr. Caden taught something other than tax, believe it or not. Yeah, it's crazy. Hard to believe, but she's kind of been the primary tax professor for so long, that's pretty much all she teaches now. So yeah, both those conditions are met. So that's actually setting our if condition. If that's met, we're going to say all right. Wrong, we're going to say all wrong. So basically, we're setting up same if function, but instead of saying we have one operator that we're looking for, we're setting up an and condition saying that both operators have to be met. Then we're dictating the results. Since both of these are correct, AIS and tax, it should return all right if I wrote the function correctly. Okay, and it did. If I change any one of these, so I change this to cost, all is wrong. And you can probably predict what we're going to be doing for the OR functions. The OR functions does exactly the same thing, except remember, it could be multiple operators, and only one of them has to be met. So we're going to say equals if, and then we'll start with OR. And let's just go ahead, pick in B2, we're going to say equals AIS. Then we're also going to select B2. As you all know by now, I'm also the auditing professor, so we're going to say audit. If one of those conditions is met, we're going to respond, booyah. Condition is met. If the condition is not met, we're just going to do 3 ellipses. All right. So I'm teaching at least one of the classes that I'm designed to teach. If I change that to audit, it shouldn't change anything. But again, move this over to tax. Misery involved for everyone. Misery involved for everyone.
Can you highlight just function, please?
Sure. And obviously, these are very simple functions, but getting to master the organization of these formulas is really, really important. And just as a reminder, since these are formulas that I'm actually walking through and we're working through in class, it is possible that I will ask you about how the operation function works on an exam, which again, I know is really, really challenging because you're going to say, it's much easier when we're doing it in Excel because Excel prompts us and gives us the information. But since I'm asking you a limited number of formulas, I do think it's fair that I could ask you about those. So it is important to remember what these formulas and the contents of them are. I will try not to get down too specific reference, but if I do think that there's one that's really, really important, I'll probably tell you, make sure you know this formula well. I will tell you when we do index match, and for the second exam, that is one that we will spend a lot of time focusing on. Because it's a very powerful formula, so it's important to know how the operators all work. All right. So let's go ahead and do some simple ones now. We're going to talk about the count series. So we've got some banner IDs, some names, and some homework. And I just want to kind of use this to exemplify some of the things that we use for count. Now, count is very easy, and there's a series of formulas in count. They all do different things, but it's important to delineate what each of them do. So let's go ahead and do the count operation first. So I'm just going to do equals count, and I'm going to highlight cells D2 through D7. So count D2 through D7, and I get a result of 4. So what is this telling me? And this is a really important distinction to make against one of our other operations. The reason it's 4 is because count specifically looks for numeric operations within the array that you specify. I specified this array, and you'll notice one of these is blank. Michael Martins didn't turn in his homework. And then we have 4 that did turn in homework and received a grade, and then Stacy Caton, her dog ate it, which if you know anything about Dr. Caton's dog, it's actually not that far from reality. All right. Her dog's name is FIFO, by the way, in case you didn't know. Yeah, the dog's name is FIFO. So yeah. All right. But it's looking for numeric operators is 4. Okay. So we actually know 1, 2, 3, 4. It's pretty easy to identify. Now we're going to contrast that to count A here in just a second, which is going to be a little bit of a distinction. But what about count if? Count if is kind of an if operator using counts. So we're going to equals count if. And the key to count if is not so much the specification of the range, but what you can do with the criteria. Now, one easy criteria is just to specify a value. And if we're looking for a number, we can just type in the number 10. So I'm going to count if the number is 10. And obviously, it's going to give me a result of 3. All right. I can also use a little bit more exotic criteria. So I'm going to change this a little bit. Instead of saying 10, I'm going to put in quotation marks. I'm going to put in greater than 9, which I realize is exactly the same thing, but if you put in quotation marks, you can actually specify that. And just to show that works, let's just go ahead and put in greater than 5, which should change the value to 4. So COUNTIF not only specifies numeric ranges, but can actually look for certain criteria across a value of ranges, which is kind of neat. Count blank is very, very intuitive. It's going to be looking at a certain array for blank values, which we know if we look across the D2 to D7 array, it's going to be 1. Not really too much more to say about that, but it's an easy way to pick up blank values. Then count A is like count, except count A basically says I'm looking for any value within the range, numeric or otherwise. So if we do count A instead of count, we're going to come up with 5 instead of 4 because it counts this my dog ate it as a actual input. So it doesn't matter if it's not a numeric input. If it's an input, it will count that. Last one we're going to talk about, and I know that you should be familiar with the SUMIFs, the COUNTIFs, the average if functions, as well as the ifs function. For this course, the only requirement is for me to talk about SUMIF, so we're going to talk about it at a very basic level. I'm assuming that most everybody's fairly familiar with this one already, but it's certainly important if we talk about SUMIF looking at certain criteria. So let's go ahead and use SUMIF. And I'm gonna say, I want to sum this range right here. And I can say criteria. Let's just go ahead and say 10. And then we're just gonna, we don't need to specify the sum range, I don't think, if that's the case. Just gonna add all the values equal together that are 10. Now, what's interesting about sum if is that when you start talking about the range, okay, you can actually specify different ranges from different sum ranges. So let's say instead, I want to look at, I'm going to specify instead of the range D2 to D7, I want to specify the range from B2 to B7. And my criteria is going to be, well, it's years. Now I need to do need to specify the sum range because it's going to be different from my operational range. If I set that up correctly, it should come up with 10 because it's looking for the only value that has years 10. So it's kind of nice for the sum if that you can actually specify different criteria ranges from the sum ranges, which is what the real value from that is. All right, last one, my favorite one. This is one that I've probably used in more scenarios than I can ever explain. I will say that there's multiple ways to approach what we're about to do next. There are some of them that are going to be much, much easier, but I still kind of default to this because this is how I initially learned how to do some of these analysis to Excel. This is what I call a nested if function. All right. So here we are. We have grades for the course, and you can kind of see that I got my percentages there. And we're going to use pretty standard percentage set percentage alignments. Now I can just go ahead and type in the grades. There's only 6 students. This is pretty easy. But what if I have 30 students, or what if I have 40 students, or in the nightmare scenario that I had to once deal with in my PhD program, what if I have 140 students? I probably don't want to spend the time typing out a letter grade for every single student. So fortunately, there's a lot of ways that I could associate if I wanted to do this condition. The way that we're going to talk about today is called a nested if function. Now, like I said, there's multiple ways to approach this. I do think that you could actually use a pretty standard lookup tool that would do the same thing. But I think that this is kind of an easy way to do it. And it actually articulates some interesting aspects of if functions that show how their flexibility works when you set up certain criteria. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to set up this long, nasty if function, but it's going to illustrate some important points. So the first one we're going to set up equals if, and I'm going to say my logical test is that F1, or sorry, F2, my apologies, it's going to be greater than, and I'm going to say 0.894 because I always do round up whenever it's case. Okay, so if somebody's at 0.895 on their grade, I will round that up to an A. So that's a little bit of relief. You're just like, okay, so all you get to get is that 0.895. 90 is no longer the goal. It's just that 0.895 you get in the course. So it's greater than 0.894. All right. I'm going to say the value is, if true, is going to be A. Now here's the problem, is that the standard if statement, I've got to set a value if it's false. But there's multiple possible values. There's B, C, D, and the unfortunate F if that comes up. So I can't really set another one and just use that if operator. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to set up a new if function. So we're going to say if, and then we're going to refer back to that same cell, F2. I'm going to say F2 is greater than 0.794. And so my criteria is B. Now here's the deal. You will notice that 0.794 captures both the criteria for an A and for a B, but it will not return the criteria for an A because I've already set the criteria earlier in the if function for the A condition. So it's going to look specifically for things that are not already A's, but meet this criteria right here, which is kind of the nuance of the if function. You can probably see where we're going here. We're going to set up another if function equals if F2 is greater than 0.694, then C, then F2, or so I guess I better do my if function first. If F2 greater than 0.594, then D. And then I'm going to go ahead and default and say if there's anything else, it's going to be an F. Honestly, when I write the if functions in the real world, I don't do that. I actually set up a criteria for the if function because if there's something that comes up that's really wonky, I want to get captured. I don't want it to automatically return every result as an F that doesn't meet all the criteria. So if I've miswritten the function, I don't want it to return an F. But for our purposes here, we're just going to say F. Just one F. We don't need more. Now we have to close all our parentheses. All right. Go ahead and fill that down. These look pretty good. Looks like my if function did work for all of these. Look at the dog eating a little bit too much of Dr. Caden's homework. But I'm a big fan of nested if functions. I think that you can actually do a lot with it. It's kind of interesting to see how the if functions work together with one another. Particularly if you said, I'm going to set my primary condition, then I'm going to set my secondary condition, how they don't overlap. Kind of neat. And once you get a little bit more used to using Excel tools, there's a lot of exotic ways to approach this. This has just always been my traditional best way. I will say I've written a lot of if functions that were a lot more complex than they needed to be just because I didn't know how to use other tools. But they still, in my mind, are very, very powerful and very, very useful. All right, and that does it for Excel for this week. All right, now let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit about AI. So we're going to do a real quick activity with AI. What I'd like for you to do is I'd like you to download the document AI Accounting Research Example from Brightspace. And this is under the Content tab in Week 4, just a Microsoft Word document that I put together. And I want you to evaluate the content in this paper from the critical perspective of a skilled business student, which I'm assuming everybody in this room is. You're all skilled, you're business students. So I want you to read through this paper. It's not real long. It's about a page and a half. And I want you to come up with something, anything that you identify that looks a little bit wonky. Now, I do want to clarify, this is an AI-generated research document. All right, this is an AI-generated research document. So this is going to be very important for understanding what some criteria that we need to think about when we think about AI concerns. So I'm going to give you guys about 3 minutes to read through that. I know that's not a lot of time to do an evaluation, but I want to have plenty of time to talk about some things. All right, some exciting, riveting reading right there, huh? Thinking about inventory valuation. So overall, what's your impressions about this particular research piece? It's okay. It's all right. There's definitely a few issues. There's an issue in the first paragraph, which is kind of incidental, but it'll become obvious why here in just a second. So it says the 3 primary methods are, and then it gives 4 methods. Yeah, it's a pretty big glaring inconsistency right there. But what did you guys think about the description of the methods? Did it properly describe FIFO? Yeah, did a good job. Okay, by the way, this is Copilot that generated all this content, okay? What about LIFO? Good explanation of this? All right, weighted average method? All right, market valuation method? Okay. Anybody look up the citations for this? So citations look pretty reasonable, don't they? All right, there is one glaring problem with this entire document, ignoring the fact that it says 3 methods and there's 4 methods listed. There's one glaring problem with this, and it'll become obvious why there's some issues when we talk about the glaring problem. Does anybody know what the glaring problem is? So what is the basis for accounting that it's talking about here? Basis for accounting everybody's learned in their accounting classes. U.S. Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, GAAP, okay? So we know a little bit about GAAP, okay? Did we learn about FIFO back in GAAP? Yep, you had to learn about that back in 220. What about LIFO? Last in, first out. Yeah, LIFO creates kind of problems, but it's still a valid method, at least in the United States, not necessarily internationally. Weighted average, you all learned about weighted average method. What about market valuation method? There's no problem there. You didn't learn about that. Why do you think you didn't learn about market valuation method? Because it's not a GAAP value, it's not a GAAP appropriate valuation method. We cannot use market valuation as a method of GAAP. Okay. That's the reason why it says 3 methods, because I specifically told it to add a 4th one on there. It was not a legitimate method. So this was something that I told the AI to do for the purposes of this, okay? But did you have a reassurance about saying, well, this looks legitimate. It's got a high citation here. It talks about it. So J. Smith, Advanced Inventory Valuation Techniques, Journal of Accounting Innovation. So we can just go look that up, right? So what happens if anybody goes online and looks that up? That is completely and totally fictitious reference, by the way. It just completely and totally made it up. Sure looks good. Journal of Accounting Information sounds like it would actually be a legitimate resource. Yeah. So we got fooled. We got fooled by this. We got fooled by the flower language. So just for context, I want to explain exactly what happened. I told it to write about the first three legitimate gap approved methods. Okay. And I said, I want you to write a small research paper about 3 paragraphs to talk about this. And then I said, here's the deal. I'm going to teach my students about AI hallucinations. I want you to write another paragraph about talks about market valuation methods, but I want you to say that it's a gap approved method. And I will tell you right now, Copilot had a real problem with this. It did not want to actually use information that was not accurate. It actually said hypothetical purposes only. It had a disclaimer on there, which I removed from this particular document. So it did actually note that there were some problems with this particular scenario. But I kind of put pieces of the scenario together so you guys could see. It sounded very, very legitimate. It sounded like it could actually be a real thing. Now, the argument's going to be is to say, Dr. Barnes, this is not realistic because you prompted the AI to do that. You were trying to fool us. And that's fair, okay? That's a fair assessment. But as we're going to see, AI is not necessarily correct, especially when we start getting something very, very complex. This is pretty easy. This is inventory evaluation techniques. And if you do a little bit of digging, you'll find out that the market evaluation method is not a gap-approved method, okay? So that's one of the problems here. Let's just start talking about some AI concerns. Oops, not this one here. All right. So there's a lot of different concerns we're going to have with AI, and we've talked about a few of them already, but we want to kind of highlight some of the things. So first of all, we do need to understand that AI does have existing biases within its infrastructure. Keep in mind that all of these AI tools are developed based on algorithms, and these algorithms are going to dictate the behavior of the artificial intelligence and how it learns. So think about this in the real world. If you have a certain bias, if you have a preference for information, are you going to gravitate towards that bias in your learning? Like say, for example, you just hate accounting, okay? And you have a very, very big fondness for management. And I give you a project and I say, all right, I want you to develop a context for how you'd use an information system, whether it be an accounting information system or a management information system. You're going to naturally want to do research on management because that's your bias. And that's fine. I'm not trying to detract from that. But if we're talking about overall biases and the way that information is shared, if you have an existing bias, it's going to color the way that you respond to certain queries. This is kind of a story. There's a story of this tool that Microsoft released called Tay. It's Tay Tweets. It was a Twitter account. And you can read it down here. It's the official account of Tay, Microsoft AI fame from the internet that's got zero chill. The more you talk, the smarter Tay gets. This was a completely unfiltered AI tool that they set up as a Twitter bot. Now, this experiment did not go well for Microsoft. So basically what they were trying to do is they were trying to prove that AI can learn based on input that comes in. And there was a lot of input and not all of it was friendly input. After about 12 hours of receiving input and responding, Tay was replying with very, very inflammatory comments, including white nationalist rhetoric. Because Tay was actually being programmed by the inputs that people were giving her. And of course, not all people are very, very nice people, all right? Most of the people in this room are probably pretty nice. We might joke around and might try to tease Tay, but we probably wouldn't be spouting Nazi propaganda. But that's not the way that not everybody on the internet works. And so that was certainly problematic. Microsoft got a black eye on that, had to take Tay down and never came back up. So that was one big area we're concerned about. This can actually occur in existing AI tool biases. I will say for ChatGPT, they do a really, really thorough job of filtering out information that is inconsistent, especially inflammatory information. If you get on ChatGPT or the back end for Copilot, because it operates on ChatGPT, it's very rare that you're going to come up with something that's going to be really, really out of character and it's going to say something really, really mean or rude or abrasive. But that's because they've got programmers who are in there filtering through that information, trying to make sure it does not do that. That's a real problem because the AI tool is not naturally developing. We are kind of carefully sifting through to make sure it only has existing information, which creates biases of its own. Obviously, there are biases that need to exist, but that's certainly concerning when we say that these AI tools left unchecked could develop very, very extreme biases. Next is going to be ethics, okay? So everybody know this individual here? Yeah, he used to be president of the United States. Back in the olden days. So this is an original picture of President Obama, and this is an artificial intelligence picture. Now, if I remove the tags, could you tell which one was which? Probably not. It's kind of crazy how accurate this is. This is obviously an imaging technique, but we saw an example of this already when I gave you an example of what the AI tool wrote. And that sounded like it's something that could come from a professional. It sounds like something I could write. It's very, very challenging when you start talking about whether things are fictitious or things are real to be able to delineate the difference if an AI tool can have that level of accuracy. And this is actually a few years old. We're getting to the point now that it's real. There's a high level of realism. Video examples are kind of taking over where the tone and the timbre of someone's voice and the pattern, and they're basically everything about that individual's presentation manner can be replicated by AI tool, which is kind of scary because that also leads to some privacy and diligence concerns. All right, hallucinations. Some of them are really, really basic. Okay, some of them are really basic. Here's an example of a query that was run by my GTRA when he was doing a project for me. So he said, how many R's are in the word raspberry? He says, raspberry contains 2 R's. Okay, and you can do the math. Okay, raspberry contains 3 R's. It's like strawberry, the miscounting there. But that's a very basic one. Why does this exist? Again, remember an AI tool, or especially large language models like this one, like the Copilot tool that he was using. Basically, all they're doing is they're doing text prediction. And they're trying to look and see, based on what the query is, what is the most likely response. It's not doing math. It's not counting the individual R's. It's just saying, based on what everything I've seen, based on my data set, this is the proper response. Now, obviously, this is a silly one, but we kind of run into hallucinations that become a lot more problematic, okay? And this is an example. You can't see it here because I filtered it out. Whoops, I didn't mean to. But there's a link here in the slides. It's Mata versus Avionica, all right? And so this is an example of a court case that was a few years old. And I've got it actually up here. It's the New York Times. I wanted to show it to you. It's unfortunately behind a firewall, so that's unfortunate. Well, okay. So little summary of what's going on here in this particular case is that there was a lawsuit between a man and an airline, and the nature of that is not irrelevant. But he hired a lawyer, and the lawyer wrote his legal brief using ChatGPT. Now, you can probably guess where this is going. ChatGPT wrote a very nice professional-looking legal brief that made up a whole bunch of examples in the case. It actually cited previous precedents, which never actually took place, which at first reading looks really, really good. It's like, wow, this is really well done. ChatGPT can do my job for me. Gave it to the other law team and gave it to the judge as the citation for the supports. And they started looking and they could not find any of the cases that he had cited. The cases did not exist. The lawyer got into a massive amount of trouble, and just suffice to say that the case was not thrown out, but had to be retried because the man's lawyer was basically found to be inept and could not do the job properly. So this is something concerning when we think about this. This is a professional setting where somebody tried to use an AI tool for progress, and as a result, they ended up screwing things up very, very royally. And this is actually one of Professor Templeton's favorite examples. You hear him talk about it. This is actually the case that he talks about when he talks about the AI example. So you may have already heard this one before. You can actually, I have New York Times not behind a firewall on my computer upstairs. I was hoping I could show you the case. It actually just talks about it. It says, most of the cases that were cited in the context of the legal brief were not real cases. ChatGPT just completely made them up. Now, again, this is a few years old. This is ChatGPT 3.5. The newer versions are actually a little bit better about providing research. That being said, we need to accept that when we talk about hallucinations, we can't just accept everything at face value. Some things are going to be very, very obvious when we talk about 2 R's in the word raspberry. That's an obvious correction. When it's talking about research cases, is anybody doing a capstone course this semester or taking a capstone course or going to take a capstone course, I guess mostly? Those of you who are, I think everybody has to take a capstone course where you have to write a research paper. If you try to have an AI tool help out with that, which I encourage, you still have to be diligent to make sure that everything the AI tool says when it refers to a specific citation is accurate. Probably more importantly, you have to make sure that the citation actually exists. All right, really, really important. All right, moving back. So this is a concern, a more large picture concern about what we're going to be concerned about with respect to AI tools in the future. A lot of redundancy. The skill set of AI tools aligns significantly the most highly compensated, highly creative, highly educated work. Okay. Now, this is actually from a paper from Felton, Raj, and Siemens in 2019. It was trying to look at occupations with the highest and lowest AI occupational overlap score. I think it was, I don't remember what the AI stands for. Basically, they're trying to say which professions are in most danger of AI kind of taking over their responsibilities. I've got bad news for everybody in this room. business careers were in the top 20 pretty much consistently, okay? You can see accounting and auditors is going to here up at number 11. Then we have computer programs, which is kind of ancillary to that. Actuaries, budget analysts, all of these things are things that are ancillary to business. Now, the good news is, if you're interested in dancing, okay, if you want to become a dancer, AI is not likely to replicate that anytime soon, at least according to this paper, which is several years old. That being said, we're starting to see AI artwork and AI video content become a lot more pronounced, so that's not a sure thing either. Manual labor is certainly one of those areas we're going to see that AI is not readily going to take over. But I know that that's a scary prospect to say that, what am I going to be doing, Dr. Barnes, if AI can do the work I do? Well, keep in mind that we know that AI is not infallible. And so one of our goals in this particular course is to identify what AI can do and cannot do, and to find the gap in between, and that's our responsibility. That's what our goal is going to be working for. So remember last class period, I talked about Ethan Mollick's four rules. And the fourth rule was saying that this is going to be the worst AI tool that you will ever use. So the Copilot tools and the GPT tools that we're using in this particular course, they're only going to get better over time, which is actually good news because it means that it's going to make our jobs a lot easier. And so at some point in the future, yield and prompt engineering techniques will be unnecessary. Next week, we're going to be talking about chain of thought prompting, which is going to help us out a lot in the project because we're actually going to know how we can ask better questions of the AI tools. But there's going to be a need for the human in the loop for the foreseeable future anyway. So basically, the ultimate conclusion is that you still need to be vigilant. You still need to know this content. Even though AI will get better, AI cannot replace it. We actually did we're going to be working on a project in my graduate auditing class where we look at some CPA exam scores that were performed by ChatGPT 4.0. And ChatGPT 4.0 passed the CPA exam last year. So it was kind of a difficult process, but they eventually get it to pass with like an 84% average across all the exams. That's an important point to make, though. 84% is not 100%, okay? So that means there's a 16% gap. And one of the things they're noting is that people who are very, very skilled in certain areas, those are going to be the one that drive the innovation and nature of these AI tools because they're going to need experts in those areas to be able to make sure that these AI tools are responding properly in certain prompt areas. As long as you can be an expert in that area, and I think everybody in this room could qualify for that, that shouldn't be problematic for you. And so that's something you should strive towards in your future endeavors in that regard. All right, and that's the end. And my picture up here again. Yeah, so yeah, I'm good to see that. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you all on Monday for chapter 5.